This is the WGBH Forum Network.
Let me just introduce our panel very briefly. We have John Abbott, Vice President and COO from WGBH. We have Curtis Wang from Microsoft and Yochai Benkler from Yale University. And there you go.
Thanks, Judith. And I want to thank Judith again. If I could ask for a round of applause for Judith. And my thanks to Yochai and to Curtis for making the trip and being with us, along with our other speakers over the last couple of days. That we've been, everyone at GBH, very encouraged by people's generosity and engagement. And I hope in the next few minutes that Judith has allotted me, I do justice to some of the good work that is going on from others at GBH. I think as we were preparing for this panel, I may be serving the role of the fella on the inside who's trying to make sense of all of this and trying to figure out what it means in the trajectory of the way in which we're, I would say, redefining public media and creating value. So Judith has given me just about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to live within that time. And any of you who know me know that it's very difficult for me to live within that kind of a time constraint. But let me just try. In terms of background context, flying, kind of watching with wonderment at the things that go on at WGBH with teams of content producers and, frankly, their support teams in legal and distribution, managing rights, managing the technical infrastructure. I'm just amazed that as we aspire to try to keep a culture of ambition and innovation going, I'm amazed at what folks are trying to accomplish. And all, of course, as we've talked about in the last couple of days, against the backdrop of a relatively traditional public media infrastructure. And so if it's helpful, I think one of the things from a GBH perspective is, and I think Mitch was getting at this a little bit yesterday, how do you innovate from a posture of history, infrastructure, and success? I mean, we know how we've been successful. How are we going to be successful moving forward? And so I look at open content and these questions really against the larger backdrop of what does public media end up becoming in a broadband world? Where are we creating more value? What does it mean that's very different in our engagement with audiences? And fundamentally, one of my responsibilities at GBH is to raise capital, is to understand ways in which we're framing what public media is in a way that attracts the investment of supporters, patrons, businesses, and the federal government. Continue to position public media as a valued and distinctive resource. So I look at this move into the broadband space as, in a way, against that landscape of saying, how are we creating more value, creating a story about the role of public media in a way that continues to attract resources for us to continue to aspire. And the thing that catches me that I think is worth saying before I go into the particulars on the sandbox is that we've moved 10 years ago from an environment when we were pitching an idea, a big production project. We really were in a realm of talking about, obviously, one-to-many broadcast editorial events that were time limited. And when we were talking to those investors about where we were going, we were saying, this project will premiere in October. It'll be premiering on Tuesday at 8 o'clock. We're in a world where we know everyone will come and join us Tuesday at 8 o'clock, or in millions of people. And in effect, as an investor, what you're investing in is that moment. And we were focused on that moment, that event. And now we have the opportunity, as the web evolves and these broadband resources and assets evolve, we really have an entirely different framework to share with the American people and with the investors who support us. Now we are talking about editorial assets. We're talking about an orchard. We're talking about value that is created and commences on that Tuesday night. But every year that public media is in business, thanks to, and doing its work, and thanks to the broadband environment, used to be that we would live season to season with our work that would come and go. Now, every year that we're doing the work that we are doing and adding to our editorial libraries, our value grows. It grows every year. So we are an expanding asset, and hopefully, through uses that are unique to the broadband space, growing our value to the American people. So with that as backdrop, I have the privilege of walking you through quickly the WGBH Lab Sandbox. And it comes in the context of a lot of work going on at WGBH. We've started something called the Advanced Media Group, which, again, to answer Mitch's provocation yesterday was our effort to try to get folks older and younger, experienced from a range of roles across the organization, together talking about their experiences, so that in an organization as large as ours, the experience, the insight of one can become the innovation, the insight, the opportunity of many, sharing that kind of experience. And that's going to be one of our challenges, to respond to Mitch's caution about being trapped. How do you create a culture where a single innovation across your organization becomes the opportunity for many people? One of the places that we think is representative of that is the experimental work that's being done in the WGBH lab and in the sandbox that is a part of it. Our open content feature lives within the WGBH lab. The lab at WGBH is a conceptual, virtual, and physical space devoted to opening our doors to new, diverse, and independent voices. Operating alongside our traditional established WGBH editorial brands, the lab creates a flexible space for risk-taking and innovation in this new space. The lab is intended to be a magnet and incubator for new concepts and creative expression. It has a few parts. The lab rests on 3 central programs which span from less open projects initiatives that involve us in greater editorial oversight to more open, less editorial oversight required, to truly open. First is the Filmmakers in Residence program that hosts independent producers while they work on their own independent films at WGBH. I should mention the lab is the steward to the lab. Its guiding force is Denise Stiani, who many of you have met and is here. Where is Denise? There she is. So I will quickly, when we get to questions, turn to my colleagues who are here. How many years have we been Filmmakers in Residence? 2? Starting our 4th year. Shows you what I know. The second area is 655 Open Call. This is a creative call to outside filmmakers for innovative short pitches that they would approach and produce with guidance from us. Did I do that one? Yes, there it is. And the third area is the Lab Sandbox, our first open content feature. It's still in beta, but we want to share with you our intentions for the Sandbox, for your reflection, as well as some early lessons. If a user clicks play on the lab homepage, they'll arrive at our Sandbox beta. The Sandbox invites users to dig in, play, and share. See it there on that page. It offers a limited palette at this point of WGBH footage from our media library and current productions, and there are folks who've also contributed to the Sandbox here from our media library team and our legal team who've used the Sandbox as their exercise in what it's going to take to bring things in from the archives. We expect many early users will be lab participants, so that's important for us to say. We've launched the open content feature, but in the context of the 655 contest and the Filmmakers in Residence program. Users will create mashups, remixes from the clips, and use clips in ways that we know we can't anticipate. Clips are restricted to non-commercial purposes and are intended to inspire expression and invention. We intend to showcase frequently featured mashups from Sandbox users, and for the beta site, we present a demo mashup by WGBH's own Chris Hastings, who's also here. So Chris tells me when I do this. So it's Chris's work. He says this is his first iteration. We asked him to put it together pretty quickly, and he's still going through other iterations at this point. How many clips were you using for that, Chris?
About 10.
10 clips?
10 different animation clips from 2 different libraries.
From the Nova library, if you didn't hear that from Chris. So thank you, Chris. That's just an example. You'll see on the right, one of the first questions for the Lab Sandbox, of course, we've talked about findability. We've talked about, how do you create an interface so that these tools are valuable. One of the first questions for the Lab Sandbox is how to categorize the available footage. Here you see some of our earliest efforts to organize the footage to be both user-friendly and perhaps inspiring. Beauty, bondage, culture, faith. My eyes are gone. Nature. Currently, as I said, a modest selection of clips is available, a couple of dozen right now, each about 30 seconds long. The sandbox will grow as more materials are cleared and coded and posted, and we also plan to offer an RSS feed of new clips as they become available. Once a user finds a clip they want, clips are easily downloadable to their computer. And we have incorporated a feedback loop here, inviting participants to show us what they've made. We can feature their mashups here and in the Lab Showcase and perhaps via other distribution platforms in time. Lab Sandbox implements a cost-effective blog format, and we're also, as we mentioned, soliciting comments. How useful is the Lab Sandbox to you? How could we make it more useful? How best can we communicate with potential communities of interest and new audiences about the Sandbox? The Sandbox will evolve and grow in response to user comments. We realize we're just getting started with addressing the questions we could imagine, and we'll see where it takes us, what sorts of footage we need to be clearing. You heard Sue Kantrowitz talk, of course. This is the team effort. It's the advantage of getting that group together in the Advanced Media Group and trying to figure out across functions at GBH how everyone, in effect, can participate in an innovation like this and bring their expertise. And Sue's team will be challenged as we get feedback on what clips people would most like to have access to. That poses the question back to us, all right, how are we getting into the archive and making that happen in response to our user feedback? Since the lab is about openness and diversity of voice, we want to hear from users, and we want, as often as possible, to grow the lab based on their comments. So you see there a comments section as well. And just a little bit about the licensing. The clips on the site are made available via Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 2.5 license. This means that users can download, mix, and mash up the clips provided their use is not for non-commercial purposes. They credit WGBH as a source of the footage. You saw we did elect to put a GBH watermark on that clip. And for any reuse or distribution of the clip, the original license terms must be provided. If users want a waiver of these terms, they should contact the media library at WGBH. As we develop the Lab Sandbox, we realize that our footage is more meaningful and productive for users if they have access to the means of production. Our how-to and resources page offers links to sites and with information and tools for new and emerging filmmakers. For instance, just one click away is a desktop editing tool. You can get our footage from Sandbox, and one click away from the editing tool, and the user has all that she or he needs to remix. Finally, questions that we're asking. I prepared this part of my script prior to these 2 days, and we kind of knew that if the days prior were what we wanted them to be, these would all be the questions we've already discussed. So we feel this is the best evidence we have of the success of these last 2 days. How open can open truly be? Is it editorially desirable to have all content open? What is the range? What are the circumstances? What are the context of using certain types of clips, not others? What is the comfort level of the editorial teams who've been part of creating the original content, moving it into this context? the watermark question, some of those other issues. So that's a very quick flyover of the sandbox. By way of models, I tell you, I know one of the applications a number of you have been talking about over the last few days, and then in your personal sessions, has been education. And so this is just one place of many that I'm hoping the sandbox proves valuable to GBH. Going back to the question of how is public media valuable to the American people, is the question of education and our intersection with the environment of education, both in school and at home. Public television, per se, has a dilemma when kids get to be about 9 or 10 and then leave us, and yet interact with our materials in traditional media. Nova is the most used video resource in middle and high school classrooms in this country. But now in this new media space, how can open content and these new tools help public media continue to be valuable for kids who are 10, 11, 12, 14, 17, still play a part in their life at that stage of their life where they're beginning to, and they're media literate to the point at which they're starting to mash up themselves. And so how can our experience with open content connect with our work, for example, in classrooms of history, science? So that's just one application of how these new media tools may change the way the public media is valuable to the American people. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
I think I'm losing my voice from all the conversations I'm having here. But I want to thank Judith and the Hewlett Foundation for putting this on. It's a great opportunity to come back and actually speak to all of you about a lot of the work that I've been doing with PBS over the past, 10 years or so. I'm going to come at this a little bit different. I've been a sort of an outsider-insider for the past 10 years. In 3 different companies that I've worked for, I've managed to somehow get myself involved with PBS, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those experiments that I've been doing with PBS and sort of the thinking behind it and sort of how it's gotten me to my latest project that's in incubation in terms of thinking about content, interaction, education, and in particular open content. So a lot of the discussion that we've been having is sort of in sort of the first 2 columns, and initially thinking about rights and usage and distribution, and a lot about how old media is sort of perhaps being distributed in different ways thanks to the internet and broadband. But my interest has always been at the intersection of education and interaction. My thinking has been always that one of the challenges in education is first engaging potential learners. And if they don't know something about a subject, how do you bring them in? How do you make them care? And I think that's one thing that is a core strength of what PBS brings to the fold, is that you guys, I think, are among the best storytellers that are out there. And I think the challenge with the web, like the early days of CD-ROM, was that this new technology enables a wide variety of information to be available to you. But I think information without engagement is a resource that's untapped. And I think the opportunity to bring together story with that information is a very powerful thing. Let me cut right to this. So I've been working on a number of projects over the years. I used to work at the Voyager company producing laserdiscs, feature films on laserdisc, where we pretty much invented what's pretty common as the DVD today, where we record directors' commentary and put together supplementary material. And I learned really from a lot of these directors about the importance of story and in terms of engaging people. And I mentioned before about the relationship between narrative, story, and information, but I thought what was missing in learning was this middle contextual layer. Because once you get somebody to care from the stories, a lot of times people will want to learn more about something. So how do you allow people to learn more? And that's by providing a variety of contextual resources so they can begin to form their own mental models from which then going down into the information layer allows them to test some of those models and develop true understanding of particular topics. And so it's the development of that contextual layer which has been the primary emphasis of a lot of my work in terms of doing things with PBS and some of my other projects. About 10 years ago, I was at, well, actually about 8 years ago, I was at Intel. And at Intel, I was thinking about, Intel was interested in next generation computing and why would people want to buy next generation computers, faster computers? And I said, you know, one of the opportunities in terms of content. And so the example I presented to them was, you know, gamers are kind of using always buying the next fastest computers, but we should look at how we can build cultural resources on the web. And one example was art exhibitions, because I thought great art exhibitions are kind of like film around theater around the turn of the century. All this work would come together to put together an art exhibition, and if you didn't live in New York City or LA, it would come together, and you know, maybe the only thing left might be an exhibition catalog. And I thought, what if we took all these exhibitions and created an artifact that people could explore? And so if we had a number of these exhibitions, and there were virtual exhibitions on the line, then if somebody was interested in, say, Impressionism, they could go from a Van Gogh exhibition to a Monet exhibition. And it would be a way to preserve some of that knowledge. And so this first thing, which was artmuseum.net that I did back then, carried those same architectural ideas of having the typical narrated, curated tour that you might be in there, but you had the opportunity to develop your own context, which is through exploring a virtual space, which was the National Gallery or the Van Gogh Museum. And then information behind some of those paintings, where we had drawings and letters and things like that behind every work there. Another project at that same time was Intel was thinking about enhanced digital television, and their first project was, let's see if what we put in on one end comes out the other. And they were going to send a test pattern of an Indian. And I said, you know, we got to be able to do better than that. So I had done some work with Ken Burns earlier, and I said, you know, Ken is going to do this program on Frank Lloyd Wright. Let's think about, because Ken's going to concentrate on the story of Frank, but people are really interested in the structures. Wouldn't it be great if we could reproduce the structures and have sort of the experience of walking through some of these structures and have this development of context that couples with the narrative to allow people to explore things deeper. We only ended up having 2 months to do that particular project, but if those of you that have seen it, this is sort of the architecture of it, which is narrated introductions and then deeper stories and then the context of being able to walk through the space. The following year I ended up moving to Microsoft, and I was thinking about enhanced television and how do you make the experience of the information a little bit deeper. But creating enhancements for all programs is very, very expensive. So I was experimenting with the idea of how do you create common resources that you can automatically link to programs. And so the first program we chose was An American Experience, America 1900. And what we built was a number of layers underneath the program. One was an Encarta encyclopedia, another was a picture atlas, a picture catalog, and a number of other resources. And as the video was playing, we used the closed captions and ran the closed captions into a natural language engine that would then dynamically link to some of these resources. So if it's playing and Teddy Roosevelt is coming up, you can either watch it full screen or see the captions on the side. The words would be big that would show Teddy Roosevelt, and you could click on Teddy Roosevelt, pause the video, and then see an entry about Teddy Roosevelt. But it would also link to every other occurrence of Teddy Roosevelt in the film, or you could also go into Encarta or look at pictures, or actually there was some commerce opportunities to buy books and other things about Teddy Roosevelt. Trouble here. So about the year 2000, Howard Cutler and I were thinking about enhanced television, and there were a lot of issues with sort of the balkanization of television to be able to do interactive television because of the cable providers, satellite providers, and everything. And I think at that time we felt that broadband internet was potentially the first global television network, and that it's an opportunity to reach lots and lots of people, and it's a good way to experiment and figure out, if we build it, will they come? And the other opportunity, too, is to think about creating programming for a global audience as an experiment. will people, do we want to create something, the typical storyteller's view of one perspective, but what we have the opportunity to create is providing lots of resources to allow people from different parts of the world to look at that same narrative and perhaps follow through that information and develop their own conclusions about it. So this is an excerpt from the actual program proposal where we use that same architecture of story, exploration, and information. So within the narrative itself, I'm sure most of you have seen this, so where you have the program playing and then you have contextual links that are appearing. So in the contextual layer, there's an interactive atlas which has the past 100 years where you can see the changes in the political economies of the countries of the world, as well as deep information about any individual country of 43 countries over the past 100 years. So with that as kind of our first foray into open content and allowing people to sort of find their way through, depending on what their interests are in the information. We were talking with Renata, who I think that was about 2003, about the Age of AIDS that she was in development on. And Age of AIDS was also sort of a perfect kind of experiment where it would have a global appeal and there might be different perspectives, and there are different perspectives depending on where you are in the world to create that particular example. And the things that we were trying to do with Age of AIDS were to do some more interesting contextual exploration, such as with data and other kinds of visualizations as well. But so that aired in well, as you know, in May. So I've been thinking about a new project which I'm kind of calling the hybrid content architecture, and it's called Interactive Universe, for a lack of a better name. And it's in the sort of very early stages of its incubation. In fact, I was thinking of a good name for this thing in terms of a descriptor, and so I think it's in what we've been talking about today. It's sort of an interactive Astro Wikimediapedia. And a little background on this: astronomy is really sort of at an inflection point, actually, over the past few years, with the digital sensors that have been growing in size. And the little graph here shows the growth in CCD area, which is basically how much data you can capture about the heavens, is quickly outpacing the glass, if you will, in terms of what traditional astronomers have been using. And so it's basically changing from an empirical observational science to a computational and data mining science. And so what's happening there is that there is now an opportunity to take all of that information and put it up on the web to allow anybody to have access to it. But if you think of that as sort of the information layer, how do we make that into an educational resource? And so taking that same model that I've been sort of using over the years of story, context, and data below it, is to come up with a modular system where you can have everything from a NOVA episode about the birth and death of stars to a Harvard lecture on gravitational lensing, and all of these layers and stories are interlinked automatically to some of these contextual resources down below. And one of the things might be a virtual sky, and then below that you have access to the same data that the astronomers have. With the pipe dream I have is that a kid can be interested in astronomy, learn from the basics to the most deep things, go and explore the sky, and perhaps even make discoveries on their own from being able to access that same information. So actually what I'd like to do is show you a little demo of some of this. Okay. So this is some very crude and early work. This is a prototype of, we've taken the Sloan Digital Sky Survey data, which basically collects terabytes of information about the entire sky. And so these are strips of the sky. I don't know if you can even see that, it's pretty dim, but what I'll do is I'll go and find a particular object here, say Messier 106. And what we're doing is we're going, scanning through all of this information. This may take a little second. I think the internet connection here is really slow. So let me try that. Oh, I think we're there. Okay. Okay, we are looking at a galaxy here. And in fact, the nice thing what we can do is we can sort of pan around the sky. And if you imagine this as a resource, you have basically the largest telescopes in the world available to you. And these can all be annotated, and if you're looking around and you find things of interest, you say, wow, what is that? You realize the more you look, the more galaxies there are. I'll just find one more thing, because I'm almost out of time. But over in the summertime, if you look up at the constellation Hercules, there's a fairly bright globular cluster, which is known as M13. If this were faster, it would resolve a little bit quicker. But anyway, back to the show. So this is my idea of creating this resource, and these are some prototype screens. But let me go back to. So this prototype, the goal is to be able to integrate a lot of different stories and pull together a variety of resources like the sky that we have, as well as other simulations, and provide the opportunity for perhaps people to breadcrumb their way through, provide their own narratives about the sky, and be able to share those as a common resource, and then be able to utilize some of the wonderful storytelling capabilities that PBS has. So this is a collaboration with Harvard Astrophysics and Johns Hopkins. So anyway, 15 minutes, I'm going to hand this over.
Hi, I'm Yochai Benkler. I teach at Yale. I look at these questions of open production, pure production. Let me start with 150 years ago. From about 1835 to 1850, the cost of starting up what was understood as a mass circulation daily went up from the equivalent of $10,000 in 2005 dollars to about $2.5 million. That was the birth of mass media. It then replicated itself over the course of the 20th century because what you need in order to start with $2.5 million is a business model. So we saw a stark bifurcation between consumers and producers, with passive large audiences and professional, and on the American model, commercial producers. There really were two models, just like the rest of the industrial economy, either state-owned or market-based. In the United States, because of discomfort, I think to some extent with the market-based arrangement and the absence of government-owned media, we saw the NGO model, which is PBS, emerge to correct some of the problems associated with market production, but that nonetheless was able to find a mechanism of funding, the necessary basic funding, to communicate to the ever-expanding relevant community brought together by larger markets and larger polities and societies. This ends up characterizing the last 150 years, more or less. Let me tell you a different story. In the middle of 2002, a shudder came down the spines of American supercomputer people because for the first time a Japanese supercomputer was much faster. This is trillion floating points operation per second. 2 years later, a sigh of relief, IBM Gene Blue edges out NEC Earth Simulator. Everyone at the same time ignoring that throughout this entire period, SETI at Home, a project that allows 4.5 million users to share the leftover computer cycles when they're running screensavers, doing exactly the kind of data mining astronomy that Curtis was talking about, dwarfing the supposed supercomputers, and this is, of course, a sleight of hand. Since then, things have changed. IBM has, in fact, moved forward, but SETI at Home continues. Now we have Einstein at Home. And as you look at the supercomputer models, you'll see distributed computation arising as a genuine alternative platform quite deep into the list of 500 computers. What does this represent? It represents a radical decentralization of capitalization. Computation, storage, and communications capacity are the three elements in a networked environment, the three physical capital elements necessary for a networked environment. And every connected person, somewhere between 600 million and a billion people, now has the access to the physical capital necessary to communicate, create, store, and exchange information, knowledge, and culture. Puts us in a very new situation where the most important inputs into the core economic activities of the most advanced economies are widely distributed in the population. That is computation and communications resources, and human creativity, intuition, experience, and motivation, which are held by individuals around the world. This has created a situation where behaviors that were once on the periphery, the kind of things you do when you sit and chat with people over coffee, the kind of things you do when somebody stops you on the street and asks you, excuse me, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And you answer them, either by telling them a joke or by giving them directions. Those move from the periphery of the economy, central to social life, but periphery of the economy, into the very core of the economy. We see generally the phenomenon of commons-based production, that is to say production without exclusion from inputs or from outputs. We see this happening by individuals doing things by themselves, for themselves and for others. We see it also in collaborations with others. We see this done in commercial settings and in non-commercial settings. The critical change here is that the inputs and the outputs are managed so that anybody can interact with them and use them and build on them without asking permission. Particularly we see peer production, large-scale cooperation among human contributors that does not rely on price signals to decide I will do this rather than that because I will make more money, nor on hierarchy I will do this rather than that because my manager told me. We also see sharing of material resources, about which I won't speak anymore today, but distributed computing like SETI at Home that we saw is one. We're seeing now wireless mesh networks, distributed storage, P2P networks. We think just of the copyright violations, but in fact they're an unbelievably robust data storage system that's been created with almost nothing. And we see mixtures like Skype for voice over IP. But let's go back. So what are examples? Free and open source software is one of the things we see. This is just the graph of market share of the Apache web server software. That's the web server software that responds to your browser. When you talk, this is 10 years through boom and bust, absolutely mission-critical application for anything we talk about with regard to web access. This is, the blue is the market share of Apache, which is a free software server. The red is Microsoft's server. That's how they have shared the market over the last decade. We know about Wikipedia, and we know the arguments now. I used to have to explain what it is, now I don't, but we know the arguments about the quality. But forget for the moment the arguments about the quality. If I told you in 2001, February 2001, when Jimmy Wales first put 1,000 little stubs on the web using an interface that allowed anyone without signing in or anything to edit what they wanted. And I would tell you, 4 years and 10 months from now, Nature magazine would publish an article that makes the claim that having done a study of the science entries, it turns out that full-time practicing scientists think that Britannica and Wikipedia are both crappy in roughly equal levels. It would be inconceivable. Right. Now, there are arguments about the quality of this study. Britannica has come and tried to undermine it. Wikipedians have come. That's not the point. The point is that it's a plausible claim 4 years and 10 months after the first 1,000 stubs were put on is the thing we need to deal with. Not some small second-tier encyclopedia sold in stores. Britannica, the gold standard. So that needs to be explained and that needs to be understood. Basically what we've seen, and I've spent a good bit of time trying to map the economics of this, is the shift from having 3 to 4 basic transactional frameworks. We had 2 market-based models. If they were decentralized, they relied on the price system. If they were centralized, they were firms. We had two forms of centralized firms. They could be market-based, or they could be non-market, in which case they could be either government or traditional nonprofits that had ways of collecting the revenue necessary to set up an organized model. What we're seeing today is decentralized social production emerging as an additional modality of information, knowledge, and cultural production alongside these others. And whenever you have a new modality of production creating, it affects everything. It changes everyone's competitive environment. It changes the set of opportunities. It changes what it is that people want and what they can do. And the question that we see now is how organizations, both market-based and non-market-based, adjust themselves to this new reality. Firms like IBM, Sun, Google to a lesser extent, or perhaps greater extent because it's not only in free software, are beginning to find ways to interact with social sharing and exchange, both as inputs and as potential things that they're creating. The question I think that is important for PBS to think about is how non-profits do the same thing. How you adjust how you are and what you do to plug into these materials. So let me just talk about that for my remaining few minutes. What role for the large NGO? And in this regard, you are a large NGO as opposed to the two-person or three-person things we currently see leveraging peer production. The first thing to remember is physical capital is less important, but professionalism is still valuable and scarce. The ability to apply consistent, over time, high professional effort towards something that then cooperates and shares with large-scale distributed small contributions is central to what's the continuing role, I think. The problem is to identify where the professionalism and capability to dedicate full-time employees can seed and leverage social production. We see IBM and Sun, for example, paying full-time engineers to work on free software projects that then the companies don't exercise control over. We see Google buying Blogger and building platforms for people to deliver content and ultimately finding a different way of working with it. The question is how to design and seed platforms for collaboration, how to add editing, crystallization, and certification, the things that an organization like this has. So again, if we go back to we didn't plan this, but if we go back to space, Mars click workers. Images brought from Mars need to be converted into maps. Used to be done by, not used to be done, still done by fully trained PhDs on a full payroll. Instead, what you have is an experiment where they chunk it up, and they create an interface that allows people to identify, here's where I think the crater is. It says, your task, should you choose to accept it. Click on 4 points around the rim of each crater. You may ignore craters that are smaller than this. Then you compute, after 6 months, 85,000 people collaborated. You compute the average. The results were, quote, practically indistinguishable from those of a fully trained PhD. Curating what exists in the world. This is, if you Google Viking ships, you'll find this, and has been now for 5 years or more that I've been using this. It's still one of the top 2 or 3 always, in terms of resources about Viking ships. It's produced by a 5th grade teacher in Gander, Newfoundland, from his classroom. Curating these is another function somebody that has that level of visibility as PBS can do. That's what I call individual commons-based production. News. The only photos from inside the underground in London were mobile phone photos. Well, the BBC, to some extent, learned its lesson. We begin to say, help us make the news. I wonder if there's anybody here who could talk about this and how much it actually works. But to somebody, an observer from the outside, this is a first step in understanding we are not the only ones, as professional journalists, who can go out and sense the environment and understand what's there. We can also provide the platform for collecting and accrediting what's there. A different model, Josh Marshall's Talking Points memo, is a blog sort of in the middle of the Democrat sphere, where you have somebody who says, I am a professional journalist, or was. I have cared deeply about values of professionalism. You come to me because you trust that I write these things that are good, but I also integrate you Initially, very limited ways from users sending email, now building a more of a network with TPM Cafe of people who are academics, public figures, etc., who provide commentary and opinion, basically creating a platform for collaborative news and commentary collection between people who contribute, ranging from just sending an email saying this so-and-so is happening, to people contributing more commentary. So again, here's an intermediate model of someone who continues to say, I value journalistic values. I can live off doing this on a small scale because I do it out of my apartment with these little ads on the side, and I interact with you and leverage my professional values with you. Now, this is one person, but it's a model in a sense for the way in which you can begin to see how the ability to apply full-time journalistic and professional values to create not a finished product that then people can play with, but to form the basis or a central node in a network of social relations that together make a product that is both more participatory and better. This is not, of course, politically oriented one way or the other. It doesn't have, it's neither left nor right. It can be used in all directions. But again, this is an interesting form of media literacy education. If you begin to think of the feasibilities of media literacy, the ability to research the underlying materials, the strong ethic within the web and the blogosphere to say, here, see for yourself. Don't trust me because I'm an authority figure. The point is not trust me. The point is, here, see for yourself. Here's link to somebody else who's said it already. Right? The beginning of educating people to be critical readers as opposed to acceptors of authority, and my authority is better because I'm not corrupt in the market, but rather I am better at giving you the materials you need to do in the platform you need to have, so as to trust me somewhat more, but always provisionally. So, the critical long-term shift is the emergence of social production. The main challenge, I think, for public broadcasting is to find ways to use its expertise, its the enormous trust, and the fundraising capabilities to build on and provide platforms for peer production of public discourse, of education. Open content, understood as digitization and making available of the existing content, is part of that, but needs to be understood as part of seeding that as opposed to that's the project. Digitization of archives is important, expensive, hard, but transitional. The core problem is building platforms and the materials. Once you're looking at new materials, how do you dedicate them to the commons in collaboration platform? This is likely more important on a going forward basis, but in both cases it needs to be integrated into seeing the role as being a node in a social network of collaborative production. Thanks.
Should we start with seeing if we have someone in this room who would like to talk about how the BBC sees the questions that nobody raised, perhaps?
Well, the news, yeah. I don't know the latest details on this, but I know that the impact of those pictures from the underground last July means that the BBC opened the door to people to send in pictures for any news story. And there's been a massive influx. And the real issue for the BBC has been now how to moderate that enormous input of visual citizen journalism. And if they're going to use it, the other problem my journalistic colleagues have is authenticating material as well. So, in other words, I think it raises a lot of the points that you've raised, that it's about the transition from this being this authoritative body that is moderating content to being a different kind of NGO or public body, which in a sense creates a public space for others to use it. I don't think we've made that transition yet, but it's an interesting example.
Are there any mechanisms? I'm sorry, I should have asked while you were still holding. Are there any mechanisms for trying to allow users to participate in filtering out the material? I mean, one of the things that I think any major open peer production system has is a glut of information and a question of how you iterate, of how you solve selection. And I chose to give you Josh Marshall as an example because it's the closest model that I can see in a blog that actually expresses these values and still works through one person or two people. But the more common approach is to actually iterate the point of relevance and say, what do people think is important? So inviting in the viewers and saying, not what's cool, not what do you like, what is in your judgment is the kind of thing that the BBC ought to be looking at as among these pictures. In the same way that Wikipedia says, this isn't about anything you want to write. We're trying to produce an encyclopedia here. If you want to write expressively, go somewhere else. And enforces that more through a sense of social commitment to the project than through any technical means. And I wonder whether the BBC, particularly because of its cultural salience in the UK, could actually develop a relationship not only in the initial raw images, but also at that problem of creating an intermediate interface between the raw images and ultimately the professional judgment that begins to use the community to make those editorial judgments as well.
I think that it might be possible for the BBC to evolve over time into being the kind of body you described. But it's difficult to, I don't think you can exaggerate the tasks of that transition, because even though we're in this age of plenty as far as bandwidth is concerned, a multitude of platforms, nevertheless we're still working, and the BBC is still working, in an industry where there is a high degree of editorial selection for a limited number of outlets. And that's the way that the entire news gathering operation remains structured. So in order to begin to tackle the kinds of issues you described, and I think you're on the right approach, what the BBC has to do is to open up new platforms for news sharing, and it has to apply different kinds of editorial approaches to it. And those are big changes which start to challenge the BBC's own brand values, what it stood for over the last 70 or 80 years, and a big challenge to the professional training of the people involved. So yes, you're right about the direction we need to go, but we shouldn't exaggerate how quickly we can move it.
This is actually very that.
I'm going to open up another thread, so if you want to talk on this.
Just a small comment as we talk about this in the context of news gathering and public affairs journalism. I wonder if we reframe the question outside of the area of news collection, we come up with a different answer. And I think to Paul's point, a lot of the sense of dichotomy about closed and openness that we've been discussing over the last few days, I think has to do with looking at journalism and investigative journalism and the standards in which that is encapsulated and the concerns about how to open that process. And I wonder if you reframe your question outside of strict journalism into some more cultural reporting, social history reporting, and content collection, that we wouldn't have a very different response and answer to how effective a peer-to-peer and peer review archive could be. So I would reframe that question thinking that it's not probably going to succeed first and foremost at the BBC News Division, or at that matter, PBS News Division. So there are other editorial production places to look for really wondering about engaging that kind of community peer-to-peer, where the editorial bars and approaches are going to be necessarily different than going to be news gathering. So I would suggest we look to cultural reporting and social history reporting as a place to really consider projects involving community in the ways you're describing.
I come into the conversation very late at the end of 3 days, so I think there's a lot that I'm probably missing. I don't think anyone can transition everything immediately. The whole purpose of trying to analyze the underlying driving forces and abstract the components of what it is that makes for peer production, trying to find analogies from business spheres, trying to find analogies from material sharing of resources, is to provide a framework of thinking and looking at whatever it is in the universe that you do. To then try to experiment in areas where you find the necessary transitions to be least burdensome, most likely productive, seems to be the most logical thing to do.
There's someone in the back there.
I wanted to ask you, in your model, it would seem that the installation of infrastructure would have an effect, and that more bandwidth, more high-speed connections would accelerate the process. Do you have models coming from Japan or Korea who have significantly more advanced internet systems than we have that show where this process goes?
That's a really good question. Yes, and no. The no part is that that's not a research path that I've taken, and so I can't speak with it with any decent authority. So the yes parts are therefore one step removed, reporting on other people's work that I have some familiarity with, but not intrinsic familiarity. There's very interesting work from Mizuko Ito, for example, at USC on mobile youth culture in Japan, where the fact of widespread adoption has created a much more completely connected, particularly in youth culture, set of relationships that allows them to, and she describes very nicely how it allows them to negotiate private spheres and public spheres, authority structures in home and school, and peer structures in ways that seem, at least from our perspective here, to be much more thoroughly integrated into their lives than we see here. However, that's much more of a mobile culture than a PC culture. And a lot of what I say here is not only about the connectivity, but also about the capabilities of manipulation that are in the machines at the end. In Korea, I don't actually know of any good studies. I mean, there's for the relative cultural salience of online games, for example, is completely different. I mean, the people describe a game called Lineage as having a larger following with about 4 million users than any given program, that there are 2 or 3... Now, this is all literally hearsay on hearsay on hearsay. This is not even reading anything. This is just chattering. The chatter is that there are a couple of channels dedicated for people to sit on TV and watch other people playing computer games. Now, it's quirky, but when you think of a massively multiplayer online game, not as something completely different than film, but as richly rendered, immersive narrative that is fictitious, then what you're saying is that these games are a platform for people to engage in collaborative, richly rendered storytelling. And what you're doing when you're watching that on TV is you're watching a program that's produced not by a producer and a director and somebody behind the camera, but by people playing a game. And so that begins a little bit, but with all of the caveats. I don't know.
I have something that I wanted to talk about somewhat related to this, which is peer production and production in general. I think it's pretty easy for a lot of people to be able to, if they're a subject matter expert, to go into Wikipedia and sort of add an entry because they have deep personal knowledge of something. But I think I'm wondering about how many people can actually be linear media producers. And as sort of what prompted me to question that was, I asked my friend at San Francisco MoMA, which I think about a year and a half ago decided to open up the opportunity to create a curated tour at SF MoMA as a podcast, and they invited people to download their podcasts, and the curators of the museum were kind of freaked out because they, as the authority, what are these people going to do? And it was interesting because I talked to him about a month ago. I said, so how's that program going? He says, well, it's amazing. It's been about a year or something, and we've only had 4 podcasts downloaded. 2 were kind of really nothing. One guy did it because he did it on a lark, and it wasn't particularly good. And there was one guy who was actually pretty good. So, my question here, which is sort of germane to this group as linear media producers, how much of the peer production and the audience are going to have that same skill to be able to produce at the level of this organization?
Should I answer?
Peer,
I think it depends. But I've written a lot about peer production and tried to analyze when it does and doesn't work. And one of the basic constraints is the degree to which the project can be broken up into chunks or modules that are sufficiently coherent and are capable of integration so that the ultimate product can be seen as a coherent whole. So having not looked at this at all, one thing one would imagine is that if instead of having a podcast that you supposedly walk through the entire exhibition, which is a complex narrative that basically is in interplay with a story that's already there from the exhibition, what you had instead was a platform where everybody standing in front of a picture could add something. And then somebody else could then mesh it together and say, this person did that. And at the end of the day, what you would have would be a conversion of that project into a single narrative that you would then walk around. You might come up with something that would be useful. That would require investment in creating the platform that would allow chunking up of that task into tasks that are small enough that you can actually aggregate. But not everything can be done by everyone, not all project. A novel is not going to be chunked in this particular way, and in that regard, a program that is a complete, sustained effort with high production value that tells a complete narrative is, in that form, is not going to be amenable. It'll have to be something quite distinct that will be accepted as that model and could be produced in that way.
I mean, if I could throw something in from the standpoint of producers or stations in our world who now have to think about putting ourselves on a path with this endpoint. This has been the presumption of an endpoint that is, for lack of a better term, primetime television, right? So your question is, how could we produce at that level? And I was continue to be taken by some of the comments Mitch made yesterday that to what degree, as we see ourselves as public media, what are our metrics of success in these outcomes? And one way we may be trapped is in evaluating our final expression of success as, is it a drive time radio program, quality, or is it a primetime television show? And one of the things that intrigues me about the question, well, watching Paul's clips over dinner the other night and then experiencing Chris's work, is to remind myself that the experience of going through and manipulating materials and creating something personally, at first I'm sitting there watching Paul's material saying, okay, I'm at home, it's 8 o'clock, is this something, am I with another million people watching Frontline, right? or am I seeing the output of someone who's had a personal experience with these material that's been profound? So I think one of the challenges for us in public media is understanding the potential of public media in all of its facets, in all of its, for lack of a better term, markets. And as I mentioned, one of the markets that fascinates me that we're looking at GBH is the education markets. And I don't just mean the classroom there. The experience of a ninth grader who's looking over material, and I don't expect my daughter, I don't expect her, when I see her now manipulate media in a way I never had the ability to do this, I don't expect her final piece to be primetime television. But I'm amazed at how the opportunity to engage in these media materials and these rich resources in broadband have changed her level of engagement with material from what I had when I had the old Encyclopedia Britannica or the Columbia Encyclopedia. But part of our trap, back to Mitch's point, may be the trap of kind of a too narrow metric of success. And what's the end point? And in the education markets, and your Viking example is a really interesting one, is there a community of users for who the outcome for which is, if they were collaborating on something, the output of which would be evaluated as, am I creating the right tool for my students on Viking history? Am I making progress there against that metric? And so one of the things that interests me is where are those communities of interest, and what could those outputs be defined as for 10th grade science teachers? We just, the documentary on Eugene O'Neill that was on the air last year from Rick Burns. Others know that I'm intrigued, having picked up O'Neill in 10th grade and struggled with it just living off the page, having not, I would have loved to have had a rich broadband resource to have kind of had some context on O'Neill before I got into it. And so what's that world? And so I think that's one of our challenges is what are our markets? Who are these communities of interest we could connect with? And then not get trapped in necessarily evaluating success on the basis of reaching 3 million people with a primetime broadcast.
Hi, I have a question for all of the panelists to speculate about the future a little bit. I'm wondering if sort of this new cultural acceptance for info coming in that is not necessarily authoritative or various models of info sharing without one single authoritative voice to authenticate will change the way we do business in the future, how decision making occurs in corporate America, how people are able to lodge their expressions and decisions are made in government. I mean, it's a potentially huge sea change in authoritative decision making. How might it affect other models of economies and governments in the future? And we'll never know if you're right anyway. Unless we come back together. So it's just sort of we're on the cusp of maybe a new cultural shift. What might it be for other institutions?
I'm happy to. I think it's all for the better. I think the illusion of certainty, the acceptance of authority because there's only a limited set of speakers and the person who's speaking must therefore be authoritative, is an important characteristic of 20th century culture, but not an attractive one. I think if you think for a moment at what somebody who is doing journalism and investigates does, certainly if I look at what I do in my own research, every utterance that I encounter I take as a provisional, as having some provisional truth value, which I then reassess when I read something else. It comes with some degree of authority based on my experience with this particular source in the past, with some other accreditation factors such as how they did it, what they did with it, some degree relying on the transparency of the underlying resources and my ability to go and check them myself, what my friends have said about it. We have all sorts of ways of authenticating when we are in a critical stance. I think if that basic attitude of critical reading, cross-referencing of resources, accepting everything provisionally, and then verifying and increasing our confidence levels based on additional resources, the thing that's, I think, the very lifeblood of any one of us who investigates, having that attitude become the broad cultural attitude with regard to both the political public sphere and culture more generally, is a deeply democratizing shift in our culture. And I very much hope that by being exposed to such diversity of quality, by being able to produce and see how hard it is to produce, by being embedded in a culture that depends on, here, see for yourself, don't trust me, we could make something of a shift towards in that direction.
We're kind of waiting for Henry to come back to ask his question, but I was going to back up to a previous point when, I know, Curtis, you were talking about eloquently the contextual linkage of content back in public broadcasting, Neil, with your peer production. I'm probably going to say the obvious, but don't we actually already have a built-in system to do exactly what you're talking about, but actually do it from the open way that you're suggesting? I understand Henry, when he comes back, will talk a little bit about kind of work he's doing with experts in simulation science. I'd just love to hear your input on taking, for example, a teacher's domain, where the crux of teacher's domain is to vet it through experts, contextualize it to K-12. But imagine if we could open it up in your way, but yet link back to the real experts in the field, and then have the experts in the classroom be part of that peer production. And so is that a platform in which we could start? There's 100,000 teachers already registered. So I don't know if that's enough of a question to get your input, but I'm trying to think of something tangible to be the sum of the parts of what you're suggesting with a platform that is based on the premise of collective intelligence, only we could be a lot more open. This might be an opportunity.
I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, part of the Universe Project is really to sort of mine that. I think I was talking to Howard about this, how do you find compelling presenters about astronomy? And at Harvard, we have some people that are the foremost in the field that will probably win a Nobel Prize sort of involved in this. And on the other hand, how do you find the person who's maybe not making the great discoveries, but somebody who's really, really good at communicating really complex ideas towards a broad audience? And there's sort of, no real way to sort of find that person. And I'm thinking that this Universe Project has the opportunity for people like that to be able to contribute their piece of it, and through social vetting, to have that kind of thing bubble up so that I could be able to experience that. And that's sort of the purpose of the model.
And the only thing, I don't know enough about teacher's domain to be able to give the details, but but building platforms that allow differing levels of engagement is quite widespread in these platforms. And if you already have 100,000 people, if you add no one else, that's a huge group, bigger than Wikipedia, for example. But if you then want to add, so Slashdot has about 250,000 people. This is probably one of the leading, if not the leading, technology newsletters. 250,000 people who are actively engaged, another maybe 500,000 who are sort of around them, but nonetheless contributing and reading, and some have more permissions and some have fewer permissions within the system based on their level of engagement. Wikipedia itself has differing levels of engagement and differing levels of more socially enforced and technically enforced authority within the system based on repeated. So building nested structures of the degree of commitment into the community, as opposed to the degree of accessibility to where the point of information or learning or teaching is I think something that there are already precedents within this system, and that's an enormous platform to begin to build on.
Hi, this is Mary McGrath. I produced open source with WGBH, which airs on national public radio stations around the country. And I just want to say that we have a platform right now that's up and working every night to do just what you said in the radio space. I guess I I guess I talked yesterday mostly about sort of opening up a conversational space around news and affairs and arts and ideas and all the things that all the radio listeners like to talk about. But we also have an opportunity, because we have a staff of editors and professionals, as you mentioned, we have an opportunity to, to have people try things out with podcasts and air the results and curate the material. And I would just love to have people help us think about how we could use our platform right now, every day on the radio for an hour, or even on our website, radio open source, to do just what you said.
I was thinking, Mary, I reread actually after your presentation the piece on the program and the way you guys have approached it in Current that was there, and the part that also struck with me, kind of consistent with my comments, was this issue of metrics. There was that part of that article where you talked about how are we measuring our success and the progress we're trying to make. And I think I'm not directly responding to your observation, but more so another aspect of it, which is how I'm worried that we will undervalue the success of a project such as that because we're using traditional metrics. And so there's the point in the article about your average quarter-hour audience. Again, that moment, right? How many people are listening right now versus the value of this as a 24-hour resource for people. And our metrics are all built on point-in-time metrics of reach for the event of the broadcast. And you make the point in the article, or one of your colleagues actually makes the point, where compare and contrast, there's another public radio program that will go unnamed that has, 5 times the audience. But when you look at measuring on the web the number of links and the value, the kind of interwoven value, the interconnected value of the space you've created over time, that other show, while it performs well in that moment as linear radio, is substantially less connected as an ongoing broadband resource. And I think one of the challenges that I'm struggling with at GBH in trying to our allocation of resources and how we value success is, again back to stuff that Mitch was saying yesterday, how are we adequately valuing the new metric, the sense of being interconnected as a public media resource over time, compared to the old metrics we had of how many people we reached at a moment in time. And I think it's a fascinating question for you building it. It would be great if all of us, along with you, evolved our sense of what does value and success mean for an interconnected 24-hour broadband resource. So.
One of the questions that occurred to me as I'm listening, particularly to the last presentation, is whether anyone's observed, either on the panel or in the room, any of the sociological or demographic factors of this kind of a shift. Because if you think of the current environment where you have a relatively small group of professional journalists and media professionals and educators who are curating and gathering and disseminating the news and information and stories to a much larger population, and that much larger population therefore has a much smaller investment of time in this process. They have children and jobs, let's say, and therefore have a small portion of their time to consume that. As you shift to social production, are we seeing who's in that larger group of producers, and do we arrive at a point where we've gone from the educators and media professionals to a larger group of people without children and jobs who are creating the content? Because I don't know whether that's true, but are they who has the time? I mean, do people with children and jobs have time for Wikipedia, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a really important question that I don't know that anyone... No, I don't know that... The closest we have to anything like that is with free and open source software, which suggests that it's not purely that, but that there is actually people with jobs and children. That's very messy because there are many people who make money from open source because the software services business is huge. And so that's the only study I know of, and it's not really, it's too dirty. you can't really use it. So I don't know.
Well, I have a different turn on that, which is I think that people put their time and attention and resources in things that profoundly matter to them. And so any of us who know, parents with kids, right, they may not have time to watch us at 9 o'clock, but they put a profound amount of time into having their kids successfully navigate the world. And so again, back to this education space, it is, I think what you're seeing in somebody being excited about Wikipedia or if they feel that they can make a contribution and create progress as they would define it, they're going to invest themselves. And that's why one of the things that we're seeing, our local team at GBH has spent a lot of time on issues of education reform and standards-based testing and how do you, what's going on for good and for ill and how we're creating a better, more fertile environment for these kids to be supported in what they're doing. Clearly, it's what happens in the classroom. It's also what happens at home and in one's community. And so that's why I continue to be intrigued, John, at the question of could we create resources that in their attention to and focus on what's going on for those kids in their classrooms, that their parents and studies show parents want to be, as their kids get older, better connected to what's going on for their kids in school the way they were when they were 5 and 6 and 7. If we can create resources that in their format and in their invitation invite them to put their time in, not to maybe create and mash, maybe it's helping their kids create and mash up, but can we get into that? Can we recreate our resource and tools to help them at that point of their lives when they're willing to commit that time and resource in the education space? That's kind of where I think we could add some value. It's just a piece of the public media answer, but I do think people have the time and attention to give themselves to something that really matters to them. And we know for really a part of our audience that when they're raising kids through that winter time, the majority of them, that's their focus. And to me, that's a community of interest. And how can we take public media resources and tools and engage and be truly valuable to that group of people who, for that 10 years or 12 years of their lives, are very, very invested in creating progress for those people around them. How can we help them? And that would just be a piece of the public media puzzle to me.
Hi, Jake Shapiro from PRX. A couple quick observations and a question. On the notion of metrics that you're talking about, John, that point about open source that was mentioned in the article is this notion of relevance as a new metric that we think of in web terms that actually can be boiled down fairly specifically, and that example is literally inbound links.
Right.
And the example yesterday that somebody put up of WGBH production being the #1 result for evolution in Google is a significant testimony to that, and it's a very different metric than the weekly Hume. But it is something that we already can measure, and we can start to look at web properties that stack up against that quite well. A question for Yochai is on that one of those slides you had where you were charting the kind of quadrants of how the reaction to the emergence of a social production sphere is happening. It sort of seems like it would be counterintuitive that the commercial firms are the first to start to take advantage of and leverage that non-market peer production when nonprofit, mission-driven groups, particularly now in this example, public broadcasting, would seem to actually be in a better position, both just because of the affiliation with that as a mission and some of the nonprofit, non-market alignments. Is it true that that's actually not happening in a way that you'd expect? Why would that actually be the first to... we do see even in commercial media now rapid experimentation and often exploitation or harnessing of the emerging social media sphere that falls into that.
There are two reasons, one historically contingent, one probably structural. The historically contingent reason is that because of the relative adoption of computers and connectivity and the internal professional norms, free and open source software was by far the most visible and also measurably effective form of peer production. And that's a space that is intensely interesting to many firms. And given that the software market is about 1/3 software publishing, 2/3 software services, and each of those thirds is larger, say, than all of Hollywood, there's a lot of interest. So that's the contingency. Software was there first. Not surprisingly, what you see when I talk about IBM and HP and Google maybe a little later coming into this is in that space. The other thing is You can be a skeptic of the market as much as you wish, but it does bite. And so the pressures are greater. And both the advantages of nonprofits, but in some senses the disadvantage, is the relative insulation from rapid changes in the world. This is what gives you the time and freedom to produce something that is not commercially appealing and that anchors in a certain set of values that may be somewhat longer standing in terms of professionalism and public interest, but it's also what makes you less sensitive to the bite of tomorrow you'll die. So adapt.
Or at least be gravely ill.
Well, with that, I want to. I'm going to veer into the bizarre, but I'm going to come back with a very specific question, and that's an educational question. There's a whole community of interactivity that really hasn't been discussed, and that is the communities that are building game-like environments and 3D immersive environments, in which there are several kinds of participation. Often these things are created largely by the participants who have special skills in building robots, their 3D worlds, and so on. But they're also interactive to the extent that people who may not know anything about creating a 3D element create social networks and collaborate and form teams and do all kinds of bizarre things. And you're in the funny position where in some of these environments you can go to eBay and buy a dance step that you can teach to your avatar. So there's this whole dimension of interactivity that's emerging in sort of a parallel universe. Now, the reason that I'm interested here is that a lot of the objects, I guess my fundamental question is, what is a public medium? And I noticed that on the sandbox example you showed, there was a DNA molecule rotating. Well, it's nice to have a static clip of that, but I think we're kind of locked in the innovator's dilemma that what you're trying to do is, of course, you want to repackage and index and deliver the stuff that could be done in the old media. But these computers can do a hell of a lot of things you just can't do with a television set. You can do a lot more, such as not just look at the airplane, but get into it and fly it. Now, that DNA molecule is actually represented in a 3D format, which went into an animation machine. Now, my question is, WGBH PBS has made things like Shark Cathedral, the entire thing. You get one fly through it for a beautiful scene. I want to get that model and reuse it. Can I? I mean, who owns that? Suppose I want to grab that. And I don't want to just see that one fly through. I want to take it, manipulate it. I want to add my own edit or whatever. Now, is that, just in practical terms, have you started thinking about how to distribute those underlying materials?
About 6 years ago, I made a presentation to folks at CPB, and I challenged them to think about television in a different way, which is, why aren't we considering massive multiplayer games? I mean, part of the problem with games is that all the experience of a game has no general transferable knowledge to the real world. Why can't we make games that do have real world scenarios and make it competitive, and where kids from all over the world can come together in teams and compete? And the role of television is more to, almost like the highlight to show what's going on in that world, and it's an incentive for kids to go in there and succeed. Of course, nothing's happened yet, but I think it's an opportunity.
But I think we're in the early stages of moving in that direction. I mean, I know we've been wrestling with the gaming's issue at GBH, and I know there are teams of people thinking about it. But I do think we have taken some steps. I mean, the whether it's the Commanding Heights effort or some of the work around Age of AIDS, trying to figure out, even in those early steps of figuring out how someone can literally touch it and manipulate themselves around data sets. That's a form of early immersion, I would say. Some chance of, like, let me find my way through this, versus just having you fix me on a narrative. And we work with Curtis on a number of these, and I think that there's a lot of juice at GBH now about the role of the deeper, I would say, let's say, immersive broadband experience to complement the linear narrative. Now, you're raising the more provocative question, saying, can we anticipate creating a new space? And what I also like in your question is, and then how
do we figure out how to invite a community to participate? That's, versus just the individual. And how do we, when somebody has that experience, reflect it back to other people? I think we're just at the early stages of that. But I think if you look at some of the things that have been done in more of the early immersive broadband experience, I think you're seeing the early stages of it.
I have to say one thing, too, just on these things like the astronomy project in Granite Heights, they're not Microsoft going into this business to try and own it. I mean, my participation with PBS has always been one of collaboration and experimentation. From my perspective, Microsoft's perspective, is to gain some insight in terms of what are the potential technologies and what are the tools that we need to consider to facilitate these kinds of things happening in the world. And at the same time, create something that's real with PBS that can benefit people in a really broad way to see and validate that model.
I mean, the exciting thing, the flip side of all this is we still have to remember one of the roles in public media I think that we do hold is we have a megaphone. We still can create those events, whether it's looking at the stars or understanding Native American history. Still, those galvanizing moments, that event that says, here's something you may not have known about or paid attention to. Come, have this first experience with it. So it's actually that balance, and we still have that megaphone. And I think one of our challenges is over the next, and John spent the last couple of days with us, now head of content at PBS. We're thinking about what do those projects mean 3 to 5 years from now when you have that moment and you're looking at Native American history or the stars. How do you, in a world in which people have all this choice, how do you still use that megaphone to say, hey, come gather around the hearth with many, many other people and take a first look?
We're really running long here. I'm trying to be sensitive to the fact that you're all got a lot to say. Please go, but we're going to have to wrap up pretty short.
I work on teachers' domain, and one of the big things we hear from teachers all the time is there's so much out there, we have so little time, help us get what we really need to teach our lessons, our kids are getting tested, and now we're thinking, oh wow, let's do this kind of iteration of a sandbox feature, lots of user-generated content, put it up on teachers' domain, kid-generated stuff, that's more. And they come to teachers' domain because it's vetted, because they know the stuff is coming from their trusted places, and we also want to do the peer-generated stuff. So it's how to, struggling with that quantity-quality thing is what we're going to do tomorrow. So if you could help us think about how to address this, we need it. We go to a place that's one-stop shopping. There's so much out there versus we're putting more and more and more up.
Well, you raised two distinct problems, and again, I want to be cautious because I haven't studied this, the teacher's domain specifically. But one is, maybe there are hackers with time, and maybe there are Wikipedians with time over the globe, but teachers don't have enough time. I hear that a lot when I talk about open source biology, that biology grad students and fellows don't. I think it's a certain cultural set of assumptions about what's appropriate for teachers to do or not. I mean, that's a real constraint. If it turns out your users don't want to be users, they want to be passive consumers, that's very hard to turn them into users. I wonder how much of that is habit that could change over time. I wonder how much of that could be moderated somewhat, and how much of that is true maybe of 2 million people, but not true of 100,000 or 10,000 or 5,000 that are nonetheless a completely different number than 20 in terms of the ability to attract. And so that's why I'm saying platforms that have different levels of engagement. And I come back to the question of how to filter. Filtering is itself an information production problem. And so the question is, can you build a platform that similarly breaks up into chunks the problem of saying, this is particularly good, this is not particularly good. This is particularly good for this kind of use in this kind of way connected to that. And then I, as the harrowed teacher, come to that judgment. But you, as the person producing the platform, are not actually bringing all the way to the point of what it is that that person wants to get just spoon-fed. You're building the platform that allows the 5,000 people out of 1 million teachers who actually do want to do this in their spare time. I mean, this is there is spare time. People spend a lot of time watching TV. That's spare time most of the time. I'm sorry.
Now, come on.
That's spare time.
Discovery.
That's a choice. How you engage with the world. There, you wanted something controversial.